Good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time zone in which you are. On behalf of my colleagues and co-coordinators, Diana Mendez, Pedro Urquijo, Alfredo Pureco, Timothy Lorek, and Antonio Chamorro, I welcome you to the Interinstitutional Global Seminar on Green Revolution, academic space supported by the Colegio Mexiquense, the Dr. Jose Maria Luis Mora Research Institute, and the Environmental Geography Research Center of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Well, it's a pleasure to have your presence today in this ninth session in which we are going to discuss the Green Revolution in Europe. This is the first one of other two sessions about the case of Green Revolution in Europe. And well, before starting the session today, first I must explain a misunderstanding about the time zone in which we are. That we have, well, in Mexico until last year, in April, we added an hour to the time zone. And this year, the government decided that this measure will not be carried out anymore. So, well, but platforms, international platforms like Zoom don't have this information, I think. So, well, this only happened in the platforms because in terms of our time zone, nothing changed, GMT -6. So, well, all are apologize for that misunderstanding. So, well, besides, I have to announce also two changes to the original program. The first one is that the presentation of Professor Michel Soyay has moved from this session to the next one, which is going to be held the next week on May 16th. So another one is that the moderator announced it for this session. Professor Wilson Picado had to withdraw because personal issues. Professor Chamorro, one of our coordinators, will take that position, and well, he is going to moderate the session. Professor Chamorro has a PhD in history of Flaxo, Ecuador, and he's a specialist in agricultural modernization in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. Well, Professor Chamorro, go ahead, please, with the session.
Hello, thanks Netza, thanks all the institutions and the other coordinators for all the effort and the speakers. But before we will have Markus Lampe. Dr. Markus Lampe did his master and PhD in the University of Münster. Then he did a postdoc at the University of Copenhagen. Later on, he was assistant and associate professor at the Universidad Carlos III in Madrid. And nowadays he's professor of economics and history at the University of Vienna. And as well, he's president of the European Historical Economical Society. He has published in a lot of journals on trade policy from 1840 to 1930, as well in about economic and agricultural history of Denmark from 18th and 19th century. Also about the Spanish real estate markets during the 20th century, and the role of communication networks in the first globalization. He has published a book in 2019, A Land of Milk and Butter, How Elites Created the Modern Danish Dairy Industry. It was published by Chicago University Press. And then Markus, the floor is yours. Welcome to join the seminar. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I assume I should share my screen if I'm presenting.
If you need, you can share. If you don't need to share. As what is?
I mean, I made a presentation, so I thought it might make sense if you see it here. So actually, if you're expecting the Green Revolution, so I don't know. No, you're not seeing. I think the whatever you see.
I think that we see. I can see at least.
Yeah, but do you see the full screen mode or do you see the reading mode?
No, I see the full screen and also the small screen. I had the same problem when I present myself, so...
Okay, whatever you can see,
I can see.
To me, I'm trying to... So first of all, I apologize because I think since Thomas is also going to talk about Denmark after the Second World War, I'm not going to talk very much about that, but actually I rescued an excuse to just talk about the research that I actually have done and not about Denmark and the Green Revolution by rescuing a term which is the first Green Revolution in Europe, which was established by especially Jan Leuten van Sanden in the 1990s, and which is sort of similar but has different political economies, of course, than the Green Revolution after the Second World War that you normally talk about. So here's a picture of the book and of Danish cows walking towards the horizon, and sort of the story is then how Denmark is basically one case in this increase in agricultural productivity, change in ways of agricultural production with the upsides and downsides. And then I hope I can sort of hand over to Thomas, who is then going to tell how the story plays out for the rest of the century, or at least the period. If he now shakes his head, I'm going to say nothing else about all this. So first of all, very briefly, what is this first European Green Revolution? Basically, and this is taken from the first 2 pages of Van Sanden's Economic History Review paper in 1991, it's basically population growth happening in Europe more or less consistently since 1750, which originally then favored very much the land-owning class and was relatively bad for the normal population, which was sort of feeling something like Malthusian constraints or ecological constraints or whatever, because the population was growing, and the only way to deal with that was to intensify agriculture, and that led to a higher agricultural output, which, however, mostly fell on the landlords, not all of them, of course, but many, and led to falling relative wages in agriculture in terms of food prices, in terms of land rents, and other sorts of things. And this process is often described as something where somebody from Denmark is famous for, which is Esther Boserup, who's, I guess, famous as a part of the development of development economics in general. And in developing countries of the 1960s, she discovered basically that people, when sort of they hit a problem with food production and with land and so on, they basically react with all these things. They intensify agriculture by abandoning fallows, so increasing the intensity of crop rotations. Often then they select the seeds better. They select better animals, which is sort of biological innovation, as Alan Olmsted and Paul Rody in the US have called this. And then especially in the 18th and early 19th century, the story is one of the introduction of potatoes into European agriculture, which of course have been all around in Latin America before. The introduction and more systematic use of legumes and clover for their nitrogen fixing abilities, and then also stuff like sugar beet, which can both be made into sugar, but which is also feed for animals in part. And then in part, to make the more intensive crop rotation possible, some of these things, potatoes and so on, actually used to feed animals who are kept in barns and not on the fields all the time, which then means that you can also use some of the other areas that you use normally for grazing, actually for this intensified agriculture, and have higher yields because you can keep more animals. Animals in organic agriculture give you the manure for the fields and so on. This model basically comes under pressure when actually the growing population is not anymore fed in Europe by European agriculture and by European landowners and by European work and European animals, but when actually the cheaper production of especially North American, Southern Russian, Argentinian, and so agriculture comes to Europe, which is the famous grain invasion after 1870, which is sort of to European agriculture the same thing that some people argue is sort of the opening of China to the world economy recently, only that in that period it hits agriculture. Nowadays it hits sort of labor, and of course in Mexico, I guess you have the same discussions about maquiladoras and exporting to the United States and so on. So this is a pressure on agriculture, and agriculture needs to do something. And what it basically does in Europe is opening up to markets, re-specializing, reacting to this global market integration, and sort of trying to trying to deal with these new conditions by basically becoming more professional and less intensive and more specialized on what really sort of is of higher importance and higher productivity in Europe. And this brings basically three things which Van Sanden says are very important for the first Green Revolution, and in part are similar to this Green Revolution that this seminar is actually about, and in part it's different. So it's the rise of the family farm, because the idea is often that in these intensified, specialized things, actually family farms have no monitoring problems, while the big farms, the large landed estates and so on, they have problems with their employed labor. And so the family farm is sort of empowered there. Then you have innovation, you have a bit of mechanization, but what you of course don't have is tractors. You have reapers and threshers and sowing machines, but you don't have tractors yet, which is why the family farm and small scale agriculture sort of makes more sense. And then you have more specialization actually in what you trade in, what you specialize on and so on, and how you use or how you deal with the challenge that actually first grains, but later then also meat and everything is coming from all over the world onto the European markets, and you have to compete. So in this, basically Denmark is originally one of the countries which has already the highest production per head, which means it has one of the most intensive agricultures. These are like wheat equivalents, which somehow Van Sanden calculated. I'm not going to talk about them, although the production per hectare, so it's not very land-intensive agriculture, is somewhere in the middle. But what you can basically see is that over the period from 1870, when this starts, until 1910, Denmark forges ahead in both directions. So actually, if you can see the scale increases here, Denmark is like going like this. It's more moving towards more people-intensive agriculture, which means also it retains more people in the countryside and retains more people in agriculture than the average European economy. And it's one of those where actually the overall growth of agricultural production, about 1.8% per year, which is almost entirely also a productivity increase, is biggest. So Denmark, you see, it separates itself from the rest as a super productive country per head, and it's also increasing more than almost any other country except from Poland, which is somewhere here at the bottom and has quite some growth. Of course, Poland back then doesn't exist, but the agriculture in modern day Poland is there. And then Germany has a similar story, but doesn't really look so outstanding or so different in this. So what I would argue is that actually most of these general processes, Denmark is a relatively good example for that. But of course, the way Denmark does it is in no way a representative of the rest of Europe, because many of the things that Danish agriculture does are specific to Denmark and wouldn't work in other places and so on. And how that works is basically the idea of our book. So these are green wheat equivalents, which is mostly land-based agriculture, but what Denmark really is specializing in is dairy production. And what you see here is basically milk yields per cow per year. And you see Denmark on average is not really up to speed, sort of with it's sort of at the level of the United States, which is cool, but it's basically they're much more advanced countries back then. But then you see basically how Denmark on average and also the average of Danish peasants who produce this milk catch up with basically the original landed estates, which had the more professional handling of milk cows, the better milk cows, and so on. So you have a clear expansion of the dairy sector in terms of the number of cows, but more in terms even of the productivity of these cows. And of course, in order to make that possible, you actually also need a lot of changes in the production processes. You need a lot of changes in where you get actually the feed for the cows from, and how you select and breed the cows, and all other sorts of things. And many of these stories are actually then part of the sort of Danish development stories. So the Danish case, I will argue, is typical in a very special way. And this goes in part into the maybe I can make this, no, I cannot make this bigger. This goes into the 20th century, basically, as I will show at the end, which is you have a set of agrarian reforms in the late 19th century, which empower the family farm. So there's a political project which says, and this is like a picture from 1807 of one of these farms, which is sort of settled out of the villages. So you consolidate property rights, you get rid of what in Mexico would be ejidos or something, and everybody gets their own farm. And of course, for that, some people need to move out of the village to be able to live on their land. So this is one of these farms, and the picture is here harmonic with a few cows here, of course, a rainbow. So it's the future basically, and the nice imagination of how Denmark is going to be after these reforms. So you empower these middle-sized farms. You also create a lot of rights for these people and restrictions. So these, if they fail, they can actually not be separated into different ones, and these units of production are going to stay there, which means both the large estates cannot grow at the expense of the family farms, so you don't have really latifundia, and at the same time, the poorer people who are multiplying because there's population growth in the countryside, the poorer people actually don't have much access to the land, and so you can use this labor in the first stage of the agricultural expansion. Actually, the growing population can be used for the more intensified agriculture. What then happens is, when the problem arises, is that basically Denmark had a discussion underway since the 1840s or 1850s about how you can intensify agriculture, and in this actually cows and animals played a lot of a role. And so some of the discussions were, for example, about whether you should feed grain to the cows in winter so they can actually produce milk through the winter, and so you have much more manure and so on during the whole year, and you can also sell the milk. So based on this, basically Denmark takes advantage of its geographic proximity to the United Kingdom, which of course industrial revolution is going on, has fast population growth and needs lots of workers who need lots of calorie food, and Danish butter basically becomes very important. And as a byproduct of Danish butter, also Danish bacon then becomes super important. And this is then basically using in part the grain which you can produce but not sell anymore abroad, because you have the competition from outside Denmark. You can feed it to your cows and produce the milk and export the milk, and you can in addition import fodder crops from all over the world, including soybean cakes from Manchuria and whatever sort of thing, and feed it to your cows, and sort of have a much more market oriented, both on the input and output side, agriculture. This works based on family farms, because these family farms found cooperatives, which is what Denmark is famous for. And these cooperatives basically have inside a cream separator, which is run by a steam engine, and there's small factories in the countryside which make butter, good butter and bad cheese basically, and sell the good butter to England and the bad cheese to the Danes in that sense. And Lenin comes to Denmark in this period and basically says, actually Denmark is an example of capitalism, because the nice produce of the Danish peasants is exported, and the Danish peasants themselves eat margarine and bad cheese. So I don't know if this is really true, but this is how Lenin basically describes this process when he travels in the early 20th century to Denmark, and sits in the Royal Library and reads agricultural statistics. This also is accompanied by the rise of agricultural science. First, this is sort of trial and error based mostly on bookkeeping, and people elites arguing in newspapers about what you should do, whether you should feed these cows and so on. And later you actually get also systematic science. And basically all this I'm going to walk you through now very quickly in the last 5 or 7 minutes I probably have left. So the first thing is just to show you from about 1865, the butter exports to England take off, and from about the 1880s, the bacon exports to England take off, and by 1900, basically almost all the butter which is sold, at least imported into United Kingdom. There's some Irish butter as well, which is from within the United Kingdom, but basically Denmark takes over the British market, and most of the production of Danish agriculture is actually made for export. This is just a spread of the cooperatives. So in 1882, there's the first one, which is there in Yedding. There's one more down there in 1882, a few around there being founded as these cooperative creameries in 1883. But by 1890, you have already 700 of them. And by 1914, you have about 1,100, which means basically every village has one of these creameries, and the country really specializes in this one thing. And these creameries then tell the people how to feed their cows. They have specialized managers and all sorts of things, and this basically drives the rise in exports and the rise in the productivity of cows. We argue that this in part starts with, for example, the very important role of accounting. So this is from 1857. So this is from one of these elite people who discuss whether you should actually feed barley to cows in winter or not, and he then calculates what the barley costs, whether you could sell it, whether you could feed it to the cows, with which milk price actually you would have break even, and so on. And of course, for that, you then get these schemes. So this is like the daily production of each cow in the farm on Fyn, and this is like from like his annual statement, basically, of dairy production in here. And in the press, actually, what you see is these elites talk about, before the cooperatives come, they talk about first whether you should keep sheep or cows, and they say cows because sheep, the wool actually is also supposedly competing with wool production elsewhere. Then feed cows in the winter, slaughter the cows and eat them, or export the meat or the dairy products, and then, at least for the most part of the country, apparently dairy products are better. Produce cheese or butter. Apparently butter works better with the existing processes. Then how should the cows be fed? So should you import stuff to feed it to the cows, or should you just use your own barley? Should you have them outside on the meadows, or whatever sort of thing? Do imported fertilizers pay off? So you can feed you can have more grain and feed more grain to the cows to have more milk and so on, etc. And then how to process the milk by centrifuges or by the traditional technologies, and also whether to have proprietary creameries or cooperative creameries. You can compare all this. So by 1882, when the first cooperative comes, the estate dairy sector basically has a set of statistics which is reported, where it says how many cows they have, what they eat, how much this is worth, and you can basically benchmark against this. This is published in the agricultural press. It also says which sort of cows you have, which system you have for making skimming the milk and whatever sort of thing. And based on that, basically the cooperatives can use the same technologies and things and benchmark against that. There's a state extension service which is run from the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural College by professors in all this, and again, people can study this, and apparently this is, again, people, they learned a lot of bookkeeping there as well, the experts for these sorts of things. So this is a photo from about 1900 or so, I think, and this is a handbook for agricultural bookkeeping from 1891. Well, it's not the handbook, it's the transcript by the guy who made the transcripts of these lectures. So maybe one of these guys down here. You see also below the level of the university, you have agricultural schools popping up all over the country, and especially Min are taking lots of courses where, again, they learn how to do bookkeeping, how they do learn how to do professional agriculture, and lots of other things. So based on all these pieces coming together, eventually you actually can use in part this data to figure out what actually made the cows more productive, because you have the output and you can create basically production functions, and you can see what is an important input in the production function, so the cows get so productive. And you can do the same thing sort of with the cooperatives in the butter stage. So what we find here is basically that it doesn't really matter how many cows you have, but it's very important which sort of cows they are. So the specialized dairy cows, which are bred in this period, are much more prevalent in the more efficient farms than in the less efficient farms, while sort of multiple purpose cattle like shorthorn is less prevalent among the most among the most efficient and more prevalent among the least efficient cows. And it's very important how much you actually feed each cow, which is not surprising, but actually an outcome of all these discussions. And also actually the more efficient farms, and this is of course sad for the cows, send out the cows much less days per year onto grass and have them calving before the winter. So actually they produce year round, which is sort of the biological innovation, which of course requires also more feed and so on. So there's some sort of a scientific approach which trickles down through extension services all through the country and is enforced by these cooperatives. The downsides of all this are, of course, that before 1870, agriculture was largely organic. Basically, they were trying to figure out how to intensify, maximize the intensification of the production. But once they actually start to do the export-oriented model, first of all, they need coal from Britain to run the steam engines in the cooperatives, to have the centrifuges. Then they depend on feed imports from all over the world. And they depend on access to the UK export market. This is not anymore for Danish cities or something. If Britain ceases to exist, basically Danish agriculture also ceases to exist, which in part happens in the First World War, when both getting coal is difficult and exporting butter is difficult. So the cooperatives and the whole system is in problems. And then actually the political economy probably plays out that, of course, because so many people stay in the countryside and agriculture is such an important business, also the exports of Denmark are mostly agricultural exports. You have actually the government stepping in, helping the agricultural sector, doing all sorts of policies which are criticized by at least some non-agrarian groups, saying as sort of being largely unproductive and so on. And sort of trying to preserve the agricultural sector as it emerged, because there's this self-vision of Denmark as this agricultural fantastic country, and we just need to wait for better times. The better times don't really come. I mean, they come for a few years in the 1920s, and then comes the Great Depression, then comes the German occupation. Some people argue that actually Danish butter helped Denmark to have a relatively lenient occupational regime by the Nazis. I have no idea whether this is true or not. I just read this in some article. But maybe mostly what we see is that actually the real agricultural revolution comes after the after 1945 or so, when you basically see that the number of farms, so these are about 60,000 family farms and about 140,000 smaller farms, that this very quickly decreases to about half that over like 20 years between the late 50s and the mid 80s. And what we also see is then we have fast structural change. So while in 1930, 29% of the population lived in agriculture and agricultural areas, 33% of the people worked in agriculture in Denmark. By 1970 or 1980, this had declined to less than 10%. And actually Denmark was becoming a normal country. And of course, this also meant that stuff like this, so two people and two horses plowing a field, which I guess is a photo from the 1920s, soon you would have one guy on a tractor, of course, doing this, and farm sizes, I guess, would also be increasing and so on. What I guess wouldn't have gone away is the orientation on commercialization and so on, and I guess this would increase even more. But I guess the risk that Danish farmers were running is also bigger, because with the structural change, of course, agricultural parties also get less important, and the whole country, of course, reinvents itself somehow, although there's still this idea that Denmark is a very big agricultural power, and it still has, I think, one of the biggest bacon export sectors and one of the biggest butter export sectors and one of the biggest chicken export sectors in the world, which I guess would be part, I don't know what Thomas is actually going to talk about, but some of this at least would extend into his part. I hope I didn't extend my time too much. I tried to pack as much as possible into it, and it's well possible that this was not all understandable. So please ask any questions once there's time for this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Lampe. It was extremely interesting. I think that this first green revolution gives us a lot of light of what's going on afterwards, and I hope Thomas Christiansen will complete this period until the 1970s. Well, Thomas Christiansen is our second speaker. He's an independent researcher. He did his PhD in economic history in the London School of Economics. He has published a lot of articles and a book about the Spanish agrarian history and the Danish agrarian history. He published a book in 2012, The Spanish Agrarian History, The Reason Why, the Post-Civil War Agrarian Crisis. It was published by Presas Universitarias Zaragoza. In 2016, he published a chapter From Food Surplus to Even More Food Surplus, Agrarian Politics and Prices in Denmark, 1945 to 1962. It was part of the book Agriculture in Capitalist Europe, 1945-1960, published by Karin Martin and Juan Pablo Montojo and Paul Presley. As well, he has been working with the Danish Refugee Council and has papers in migration, so he has a broad experience, and I am willing to listen to Thomas. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, I can share the screen. So I think
now we can see, yes.
Yes. Okay, first I'd like to say that I'm very honored to be invited here as an independent scholar, and I've been very impressed by the previous sessions here on the Green Revolution. When I was invited to this seminar, I said in general it was a great idea to look at the Green Revolution in a global perspective. So I happily accepted the invitation. But what is kind of interesting in this context is that Green Revolution is normally not mentioned in relation to Danish agrarian history. It is seen as something which happened somewhere else, mainly in the global south. And well, it's not because there was no Green Revolution in Danish agriculture. It was, as Markus has just explained, something which to a large degree took place earlier than in the period we're dealing with. And so for the years we are talking about here, the 1930s and onwards, I will argue that the case of Denmark is more of a green evolution, that means without the R, than a green revolution. And this means that although there was some problems, issues, crises along the road, as Markus also indicated, especially starting in the 30s was a global crisis. It means that a lot of the characteristics which we can find of the Danish agriculture around 1930, they could still be recognized in the 1970s. Although obviously there were some changes also. So I think what you can say is that the situation was stable but not static, and that this reflects that the farmers gradually adapted to new conditions and new possibilities. So even though I think it's still of interest in this context to have a closer look at the development in Denmark, because it can serve as a point of reference in two ways. First, how a relatively modern agrarian sector developed on its own without sort of an outside managed programmatic approach, which we find in the Green Revolution way of thinking. And second, also because the Green Revolution, I think in many ways was the intent to reach in an accelerated mode some of the same endpoints as the Danish agrarian sector and other modern agrarian sectors already had reached or were on the way to reaching. Although in this case, in the Danish case, it rather than a programmatic approach, it's developed as a response of responses to market forces and what we can call the general development of modern capitalist society on behalf of the farmers. So on this short introduction, I will have a look at what I have called the evolution from 1930 to 1974. And the endpoint 1974 is logic in the sense that the year before Denmark joined the European Economic Community, today the European Union, this in many ways changed the market conditions for Danish exports. And so the story of Danish agriculture before and after 1973, I think, is two different stories. So what I have sort of identified here is, I would say, 5 main trends in the period, what I would call intensification, mechanization, production changes, consolidation, and then finally an incipient specialization, and maybe what we call the first step to a second green revolution in Danish agriculture, at least a second revolution, which more profoundly changes the way it actually works. And then I will have a brief conclusive remarks to the end. I will go directly into it because Markus has excellently explained the preconditions. So I will assume that we all are more or less on the same page with regards to what the situation is in 1930. So we'll start to have a look at the intensification. And I know the slide is a little bit difficult to read, but what we look at here is the fertilizer consumption in active ingredients per hectare for the main fertilizers. And what we see here is that fertilizers were actually used already in the 1930s, but predominantly in the form of manure, and only secondary in form of commercial fertilizers. So what happened was that both types of fertilizer, the usage was declining during the German occupation from 1940 to 1945. But after that, it quickly bounced back and surpassed the pre-war level by the 1940s. And what we see here afterwards is that the use of manure continued to increase, but it was the artificial fertilizers that expanded most in the following years. And so by the late 1950s, early 1960s, more active ingredients were coming from artificial fertilizers than from manure when calculated in this way. So, but there's no sort of strong break in this period compared to what we see in the pre-war years. If we then continue to the question of mechanization, we have here a graph of some of the main indicators on this. And the second process of changes or the trend was mechanization, and that started in earnest post-World War II. And the dark blue line here indicates the number of tractors, and the mechanization of fieldwork with combustion engines started here in 1948 because a lot of the Marshall program was used for importing tractors to Denmark, to Danish agriculture. And here, the relatively small Massey Ferguson tracts turn out to be suitable to the family-sized farm that dominated Danish agriculture. It was relatively cheap to use, and it had multi-purpose functionality. And that was a change from the pre-war situation, because the pre-war years, most tractors had iron wheels. At the introduction of rubber wheels after the war meant that the tractors could both be used in the fields and also for road transportation, as opposed to the tractors from the pre-war years. So by 1960, that is some 10 years after the tractorization started, you can see that one could probably say that the farms where it made sense to buy a tractor, they had acquired a tractor, and the number stabilized about 180,000 tractors at that point in time. This was offset then on the yellow line, which is the number of horses, and here the numbers goes on the right-hand axis. And this declined sharply when the tractors were introduced. And from a pre-war situation, about some 600,000 horses, it reached about only 50,000 horses in the late 1960s. And about half of these were probably not even work animals, but used for sports and entertainment and likewise. Obviously, this process had another implication as well, because a lot of land used for cultivating oats for the horses were freed up, and the land could be used for cultivating feed for the cows and the pigs. The orange and the gray lines at the bottom represents two other mechanical newcomers here in the post-war agrarian society, which is the combiners and the forest harvesters. And you can see, though, they come later than the tractors and in smaller numbers. So in the first place, the mechanization is driven by the tractors in the fields. The last line, the light blue one, which starts in the late 1940s and continues after there, is mechanization off the field. This is the number of milking machines introduced in farms. And there are no really statistics on this prior to the war, but by the late 1940s, milking machines were widely used in the stables, and the number reached a maximum by 1960, where basically those farms with a significant number of cows, they had all introduced milking machines, which is the reason why the number stabilized at this point in time. So this introduction of farm machinery in the post-war years, it went hand in hand with another point which Markus pointed out, which was a decline in the number of farmhands. And this left the farmer and his family as the main and often only workforce on the farms, which in general had a rather small size, as mentioned. It has been discussed in the scientific literature whether the decline in the workforce was mainly a result of a push or pull, but mainly the main interpretation at the moment is that it probably was the pull factor which was most important. The main factor seems to be that better salaries and job opportunities outside the agrarian sector, and the main reasons for people deciding to leave the sector, and also which is more of a push. It would become more and more difficult for farm hands to acquire the means to buy their own farm as time went on. It became more expensive, and you needed more land to make a living out of the farm. So in parallel to this, we also will see some production changes, and I have illustrated this with a figure of the cultivated area. What we can see from the area of the whole figure is that there was a slight decline in the cultivated area between the 30s and the early 1970s. It's about 10%. And within this, from the 1960s, there's some changes in comparison to what the starting point was. And what we see here is that grains from the 1960s start to occupy more and more land. This happens on the expense of root crops and grass, both inside and outside the rotation. And this is mainly due to one thing, which is the decline in area of root crops was related to that the cultivation of the main variants of beets were quite labor intensive and difficult to mechanize, meaning that root crops became less and less interesting from an economic standpoint in comparison with cereals to use for fodder. And at the same time, the decline in the grass areas is probably the result of that the most marginal areas were taken out of production, and at the same time cereals could be cultivated in new areas with the introduction of the more fertilizers in the post-war years. There was also some internal changes in the types of beets which were cultivated, but I think that's too detailed to have an interest here. But the farmers continuously experimented with different type of beets, giving most fodder or being less labor intensive. So this is hidden within the gray area. It's not like it's the same situation all the way around. If we look and then open up the picture of the blue field we had before with the cereals, There's, however, some quite drastic changes here. At the left hand of the graph, we see that the light blue, the yellow, and the gray lines, they show that the beginning of the period in the 1930s, barley, oats, and what is referred to as mixed grains, each occupied about 25 to 30% of the cultivated area of the grains. But by the early 1970s, barley is a gray line here, was by far the most important cereal, occupying some 80% of the cultivated area of the cereals. And this was mainly the result of the development of new variants of winter barley that were more resistant to cold temperatures in the Danish winter. So it's not like they are starting something new, but it's sort of a biological innovation which takes place here. These changes to the production process with the mechanization, with the intensification, and also with the changes of the crop mix leads to that there's an increase in the yields of cereal and pulses for all types of products they are using. The graphs here show that wheat, rye, barley, oats, mixed grains, cereals in total, and pulses also increased from the 1930s to early 1970s. The green line, which is probably of most interest here, shows that the increase in yields for all cereal as a whole was almost 65% from the early 1930s to the early 1970s. And the dark blue line shows that the case of pulses, the increase was 55% in the yields in the same period. So there's an intensification and increase in productivity of land in this process. Markus also showed that in the 19th century, there was an increase in the production of milk per cow in the 19th century up to the early 20th century. And this process continued in the period we're looking at here. Although the total milk production started to decline in the late 1960s, the blue line at the top, and the herds also declined in number, the milk production per cow increased by some 30% from 1930s to the 1970s. This was a result of two things which was already started as explained by Markus. One thing was that a program for the improvement of the wet Danish cattle, which was the standard milk cow in the period, increased the production. But there was also investigation into the best possible fodder composition, which we also saw initiated already in the 19th century. The other sort of main product for commercial, for the export is pigs. And there's a similar development here, although it's more difficult to illustrate statistically. That's the pigs. The standard Danish land race was developed around 1900. And over the years, breeding schemes worked to increase the body length of the animal, increase the amount of meat content in the animal, and also decrease the amount of fodder needed to increase the body weight. So this similar intensification of the pig production was also taking place in the same years. If we then have a look at the situation about the number of farms and this development, Markus had a close look at this, and a short look at this in the beginning, at the end of his presentation. And we have here a similar figure to those numbers he presented, which is number of farms according to size. And what we see here is that it remains fairly stable from 1930 to 1960. It's about 95% in 1960 of the pre-war level. And the figures might sort of hide a development which is already taking place in this period, which is that the smaller farms are probably being converted from full-time farms to part-time farms, where a part of the family running these farms are working outside the agrarian sector on other farms to supplement their income. What happens then from 1960 onwards is that there's a fairly sharp decrease, especially in the number of the smallest farms, which are the dark blue side here. These are farms with less than 10 hectares. And in total, this means that a third of the farms disappear between 1960 and 1975. Especially those in the smallest end of the scale, which disappears, which is hardly surprising. But the number of farms larger than 30 hectares increases in total numbers in this, not only in relative size, but relative importance, but also in absolute numbers. But still, if you go to 1975, we have that only a quarter of the farms, 25%, are larger than 30 hectares. So it's still to a large degree, relatively small farms compared to other situations. But it's still a doubling of relative importance from 1930, where it was only about 12% of the farms which were larger than 30 hectares. Just bringing these numbers up to date, in the sense that what are the situation today, this process, which started in the 60s and early 70s, really accelerated afterwards. So today we have about 8,000 farms, full-time farms in Denmark, which is a decline by 95% compared to the pre-war situation. So this process we are seeing here is only being initiated in the period we're dealing with. The last trend we will have a look at is what we call the incipient specialization or revolution. And this deals with how the farms are organized. The typical farm by 1930 and by 1960 and also by 1970 was these relatively small integrated farms. And as this figure shows with the blue area, that some 75% of the farms both had cattle and pigs by the late 1960s. This was a traditional way of doing farming in Denmark, an integrated farm which both cultivated the fields, had cattle and pigs. But this changed fairly fast in the years forward. We can see it already here up to 1975. But this graph, which goes on to 1990, shows that a specialization starts to take place, and it goes really fast in the last couple of decades of the 20th century. And this process continues even more today. So while we had in 1968 that some 75% of the farms had both cattle and pig, the figure today is only 2%. And while only 8% had neither pig nor cattle in the late 1960s, it's 62% of the farms who today are animal free. So there's a specialization in either cattle or pig or in field production. Obviously, this is something which basically takes place after the end of the period we have here, but it's also therefore I would call that we have an incipient specialization and revolution, because I would argue that what we do not see here, but what I told you about for the period in the 21st century is actually what we would call a revolution, because the traditional family farm with an integrated production is no longer existence. It's a history. It disappeared in the last 3 or 4 decades. So just a few conclusive remarks. What we have seen is that between 1930 and 1974, the Danish agriculture gradually adapted through a process of intensification, mechanization, production changes, and later in the period, consolidation and specialization. But in spite of this, most of the basic structure which we found in 1930 remained in place. So it was fairly stable, but not static until the late 1960s, early 1970s. Yet what we also saw here in the ending was that the first sign of the next revolution were visible in the early 1970s. And so today we have a high degree of specializations on very few and very large farms. And the traditional integrated family farm is now history in Danish agriculture. So I would argue here that the period from the 1930s until at least the late 1960s or early 1970s was a period of continuous evolution more than revolution. based on those structures that was established in the late 19th century that Markus talked about in the previous presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Was extremely interesting. I think that we got a broad picture of the Danish case, but also the Danish case explains many things that were going on in the next decades. I don't know if the audience or my colleagues, they have some points and some questions that they want to highlight. Otherwise, I have. So in case that there is no any question at this moment, I would like to ask you about the influence that the Danish case had in the future Green Revolution program worldwide. I saw the case of the livestock program in Ecuador that was influenced by the Dutch. So I don't know if also the Dutch took some technologies or some ideas of the Danish. So there was a flow in that moment in the previous, in the 19th century and the 20th century. And also, I would like to point that there was several centers during the Green Revolution. But what we see with the European case is that probably this idea of Green Revolution as United States center has to be contested, as we see all this process going on in Europe previously. In the Danish case, through the literature and the presentations, I saw that they had a privileged access to markets, so the position to be close to United Kingdom and to Germany influence and help Denmark to be able to find their path. Also, the access to low input, the low prices of the inputs help as well as the technological access and the creamery separator. This was something that put Denmark in a extremely good position. As well, the political consensus that was during many decades during the 20th century helped as well to have some kind of political stability that helped for the country to prepare. As Lampe has pointed, the diet changed. Like the Danish had to access to margarine, but they were exporting butter. It's something that also we can see in the developing world nowadays. So it's also interesting to point. As well, this specialization, the increase of pigs. I can imagine that Jutland was an area of specialization, and they bring environmental problems as well. I can imagine. Probably you can point these things. So how Green Revolution and specialization brought to this kind of things. Also the accounting, the rational thinking that we saw in the 19th century that Lampe was pointing. I see that was part of Green Revolution. There's some kind of technological thinking versus the small farmers. I think that all these issues probably give us floor for discussion. I don't know who wants to answer first. I would like to point as well that you can make the questions in English or in Spanish because for the audience, because at least Markus can speak in Spanish and probably Thomas can answer some kind of Portuñol, which is wonderful for us as well.
Thomas, do you want to start?
Not necessarily. So I don't. Would you? I'll give the floor to you, Markus, and then I'll pop in later, if it's okay.
Yeah, I try. So Denmark and the Green Revolution elsewhere. I think that's a topic I don't know much about. I know that the FAO, for example, had commissioned some Danish, in part agricultural historians, Skrubeltring and so on, to write actually about the Danish model, and this was then diffused, and people like Nehru and so on prior to this basically became fans of cooperatives and so on, based, I think, in part on reading the Danish example, which is also in Lenin there somewhere. And there are Africans, there's studies about Tanzanians studying these cases through the strangest ways of getting this. So there seem to be some underground fluctuations, currents sort of leading towards from Denmark towards this. There's also, of course, the Danish Danida, the Danish Association for Development Assistance or something, and I think they try to set up some things like slaughterhouses in Africa. They try to export Danish red cows to India, and then apparently, at least this is what I heard in some talk, these poor cows died because they didn't resist the climate in the subtropics and tropics, which again is, I guess, an example of how difficult it is actually to translate some agricultural practice from one place to another. So what I have read is mostly attempts and failures at directly transferring Denmark somewhere else. But I guess the agricultural expertise was also part of the global expertise that went into all this. With the bookkeeping, actually, that's something Paul Schaap and I are working on now, sort of, because there are all these initiatives in Denmark and all over Europe, actually, to actually get farmers to do accounting, and so there are. There's a government bureau for agricultural management, which sort of sets up accounting offices and asks people via the agricultural associations to do accounting, and it is quite unsuccessful. So what the Danish farmers like is to do these sorts of benchmarking exercises where they write down what they feed their cows and then the milk yields and so on, but they don't like financial accounting. Maybe because they don't like to pay taxes and they're afraid that if somebody sees this, actually they figure out that you have more than that. And actually there's a fight going on whether farms have to do tax declarations in Denmark until after the Second World War, I think, in comparison to artisans or something who have similarly big businesses but actually have to do accounting for the taxes. So actually the agriculture, we thought this was a super important part, and we think it still is, but it's actually a small sample, a small set of people who do this. So these are elites, these are farmers who want to be sort of in conversation with these elites, and these are people who work sort of with the agricultural stations and so on, and from there it seems more that the extension services actually gain the information, and then via the cooperatives, via the agricultural associations, they just tell people how to do best practices. And what the real farmers then do is they compare the milk yields of their cows and the feeding practices to those of their neighbors. They have like expositions and shows and whatever to show the biggest, longest, fattest pig and how they made that and so on. And of course, there's also competitions for the cultivation of fields and how to get the biggest yields of your crop rotation and so on in this. But basically, it doesn't seem to be that accounting and sort of fomenting rational peasants through this is actually working this way, because I think the capabilities of the Danish farming associations and so on are so good that actually the individual farmer doesn't need to be rational. He just needs to learn from the others what to do, basically. And this was sort of a discovery about the failure of these accounting initiatives, even in the countries where you would suppose that the farmers actually wanted to learn and so on. But actually the state, the farmers were also a bit anti-estatist, so many of the educational initiatives are bottom up and so on, at the same time as, of course, they are part of the state because they are so powerful politically. They sort of try to keep the state, I think, in part at arm's length, at least about their things. Environmental impacts, yeah, I guess they are there from the intensified cultivation. Some people say the whole thing with the agrarian reform actually starts because you have an ecological crisis in the 18th century, because you cut down all the trees and whatever and didn't really do well and so on. I don't know so much about that, but surely this has impacts already before you get the chemical fertilizers and so on, I think. Because I guess so dense amounts of cows and pigs, they must sort of do something to the groundwater and so on. But I think Thomas might know more about that, because that's potentially more general about living in Denmark and knowing about what agriculture does to people and so on. So I don't know if these answers are in any way useful, but I try to sort of address at least some of the very interesting points that Antonio was raising.
I was thinking about a couple of things as well. On a general level about this exporting model, which in last respect is quite successful. I think it also tends sort of to maybe overlook that when it actually, the first revolution that Markus talked about took place, it was actually a confluence of a number of different factors at the same time. And so you have the technological improvement, you have the cheap range overseas, you had also at this point in time, the construction of a lot of infrastructure, which makes it possible to export things to the UK and to Germany also. And the technological innovation about how we improve the production and the quality of the butter, stuff like that. And a lot of these things which comes together in a fairly short period of time. And it probably also makes it difficult sort of to copy these sort of lucky punches or whatever you would call it, because you need a lot of things at the same time to be able to get this. And what we can see is that when some of these things are missing, it comes into some problems. And Markus talked about the First World War, but obviously the crisis of the 30s, the global crisis of the 30s, put the agrarian sector, I haven't talked about this here, but put it into a dire problems, right? And they were helped significantly by the government, because they said, okay, we need to have some sort of control with this, because a large part of the economy, we earn foreign currency by exporting to Germany and the UK. So they had a very extensive and a very intensive price supporting scheme in place in the 1930s to help this survive, because it was one of these factors, which was export, which obviously was extremely important, which was just not in place in this kind of period. And something similar also took place in the 60s, because Denmark didn't join the EEC until 1973. So while the British market was still there, it was not expanding anymore, and the German market was closed, or the EEC was not open to Danish exports. So again, that the government stepped in and made price schemes to support the agrarian sector in these periods where there were problems within this confluence of factors which were necessary to have this up and running. So I think that's also an important point to make when you talk about, can we replicate this? Because, well, it's not only putting some dairies in and do some cooperatives, there's a lot of other things which needs to be in place as well. One thing on a low practical level, I think what's interesting here is that the extension services that was also put in place, because these, interestingly enough, was often paid for by the cooperatives, the farmer cooperatives, which meant that the experts came, not those from university, but those who were supposed to extend the knowledge from universities into the farmers. They were paid for by the farmers. And this meant that if the advice they came on with the knowledge they had were not good enough, they would lose their job, right? So it was sort of not you didn't have some expert coming in from the outside saying, now we have to tell you how things have to do. And then the farmers could use this more or less. No, it's just like if it didn't work, they were going somewhere else. And that probably was a small thing, if you say, an organization probably is quite important in the diffusion of knowledge, because it had to be usable directly by the farmers. And this is the third point I'd like to make also, is that the whole question about the political economy of this is, we haven't talked a lot about it in this seminar, but I think it's also a very interesting topic, but we probably need a separate session for this in itself, both in the period Markus talked about, but also in the 30s during World War II and the period in 50s and 60s. So the picture is not complete without this, but taking this in would extend the time frame required quite a lot.
Thanks, Thomas and Markus. Now we have a lot of questions. So Carlos Reboretti is asking, did the guano paid off in 19th century? I read all the questions, okay? Rajeswari Raina from India, I asked how the state played a role in the Green Revolution evolution in these countries, or perhaps in Western Europe in general, and perhaps again, beyond just supporting agricultural research, so giving subsidies, so how the state played a role in the Green Revolution process. Hiromi Mizuno is asking to Markus, thanks all of you for the presentation, and is questioning, did the colonists in West Indies have any impact on agriculture in the metropole? So I give you the floor.
Well, about the guano in the 19th century, I think it's more a question for Markus, but at least it was imported guano from overseas, but I'm not quite sure about whether they decided it paid off or not. But my impression would be that it was used quite a lot. The state, that's sort of coming back to the political economy, which I talked about before. So just to resume this, so you say, at least for the years I'm talking about, then when there was a period of crisis, the state intervened, secured the prices for the farmers if there was export crisis. And in the case of the World War II, where the situation was more of a problem for consumers, the state went in the other way around and put in maximum prices for the consumers to secure that they were not running out of foodstuff during the German occupation. But what actually took place was that, ironically, the situation was, one would say, since British exports to the UK were cut off during the German occupation, and only some of it went to Germany, the general nutritional situation was in many cases quite good in Denmark during the World War II, in comparison with many other countries in Europe under German occupation, both in Western Europe, but especially in Eastern Europe, obviously. So what we have here, if you look at the state in this sense, you would say the two dominant political forces in the 20th century in Denmark was the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party, with the Liberal Party closely connected to the agrarian sector. Right? So these two sort of tipped the balance back and forth, depending on whether they were in government or not. But in general, you say they couldn't either of them live with starving out the opponent sector. The farmers couldn't, the Liberal Party couldn't live with too bad condition, harsh condition for the urban population, and the Social Democrats needed the export money to the industrialization process, which they saw sort of the main economic goal for the second part of the 1900s. So it was, I think it was not an easy relationship, but it was sort of a mutual acknowledgement of the importance of both feeding the urban population and keeping the farmers to some degree happy by making it possible to export to the UK and to Germany.
Yeah, so maybe if I can add to that, I mean the Danish colonies, the West Indies, they might have mattered in the 18th century by empowering a few people who got rich of that, Schimmelmann and so on, who somehow were part of the group of people who were promoting the agrarian reforms and so on, and built up cultural centers in that area. I think during the 19th and 20th century, basically neither as an export destination nor as an import destination, I think they played a large role. Maybe Thomas knows more about the Danish history of that, but I mean they were eventually sold to the United States. And there's quite some literature, I think, from the late 18th century that it was, I mean, this was smuggling places and so on, because actually Denmark was too far away and too small and too unimportant to actually be able to continuously interact with them. But a few people, of course, got rid of this, and there's a West Indian company as well, which is of course much smaller than the British ones and so on. So in general, I would say they didn't, but there might be some undercurrent where then something actually mattered for something in Denmark as well. Yeah, so not really a good answer to that question. Guano, I mean, in this journal, the Tidsskrift for Landøkonomi, the Danish agricultural economics review or whatever, the elite newspaper, they basically at least somebody, an elite guy, Edward Testorff, who's like the guy who has the model estates on everything, he writes a paper saying, does it pay off to use guano? And he shows, yes, it pays off because it increases the barley yields, and the barley yields increase the feed for the animals, and the feed for the animals then, and so on. So you can intensify agriculture by that, and at least this is based on accounting data from his farms, how representative this is, and how much this then feeds into extension services or sort of the attempt to popularize this in the mid to late 19th century. I honestly have no idea, but it seems to be, since, as Thomas says, guano is imported, and it's not small amounts of guano which are imported, but quite sizably stuff. I guess it must have been of some use for Danish agriculture as long as it was around. But I haven't tried to quantify how much it matters. And with the state, maybe one thing which out of Thomas' explanation came is that actually Danish peasants are liberal, which is pretty unusual, at least for European farmers, which is part of this unique story, I think, of the Danish family farm, the reforms and so on. And the conservatives are the estate owners, basically, and a few industrialists. And so the first clashes between the farmers and the estate owners, and then later you have sort of the clashes between the three, where basically some sort of co-evolution between the Social Democrats and the Liberals basically plays out the political economy between the laboring class and the agricultural interests, where actually the farmers in the beginning are very powerful and use many of their state capacity for actually the own benefits and the survival of their sectors and so on, with these price schemes and so on. One thing which is sort of funny is that Denmark gets one of the earliest and strictest margarine laws in the world, because what they have seen is that the Dutch dairy industry suffered a lot from margarine being exported to Britain and sold in Britain as butter. And that was really bad because nobody then believed that the Dutch butter was really good. So in Denmark, you were not allowed to put yellow color into margarine and sell it as something like butter. So Danish margarine looks bad and cannot be exported and is actually not exported in the late 19th century, when it's the original margarine which is made of beef tallow and not the margarine which is made of vegetable sources. This also means that one of the biggest margarine producers in Denmark is actually setting up a big factory in Manchester, apparently the biggest margarine factory in Europe, because he cannot use Denmark as a basis for exporting because there the laws are so strict and so on. So there's a similar story for Wisconsin in the United States, where apparently you have to color margarine pink, so you cannot confuse it with butter and so on. So whenever the government can actually do something, I think, for agriculture, it does that. But this is a period of laissez-faire, and the farmers are very much in favor, I think, of laissez-faire until the crisis hit them, and then they asked for protection, for price schemes and so on in the First World War and the Second World War, and when the European integration process basically shuts them off. But it's also a period when this makes sense, because the agricultural market in the United Kingdom is wide open for imports, which I guess is also different to what the situation of most agricultural exporters in the 1960s, 70s, or today is, where we have everywhere the consequences of price stabilization schemes in the advanced countries, I guess.
I see that Diana, our colleague and also coordinator of the seminar, is making a question. Go ahead, Diana.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentations. Have been very enlightening on Denmark case. I would like to know a bit more about data creation and management. I know Markus already mentioned some elements, but I would like to know if the agricultural survey model was integrated into the farm accounting model. My question has to do with my interest in knowing whether this was a way in which certain Americanization of the international language of experts in Denmark permeated also, as it was the case on post-war period in Germany. I hope that this makes sense to you.
Thomas, I guess that's for your period.
Yes, and I must admit, I didn't really get the entire question, so maybe would you repeat it in Spanish? I will try sort of make it clear for me.
Claro, me gustaría saber si en el caso que estamos comentando el día de hoy, el método de la survey se incorporó al Pharma Accounting como fue el caso de Alemania durante la posguerra.
Not that I'm aware out of my head, I must say. No.
Okay, thank you.
So that was a short but brief answer, but not, no.
Maybe a bit of what I can say from the interwar period when this Bureau for Agricultural Management is set up to make this. This is based on a Swiss example. So in Switzerland, they start for the first time to collect these agricultural accounts, and they found the International Institute for Agriculture. And this basically makes some sort of schemes, which then other countries copy. And Denmark is one of the earliest ones to copy this. And in this, actually, you have a mix of accounting results and production data, like this stuff on what you feed to the cows and how you cultivate the fields and so on, which goes into that. So probably this has nothing to do with what you ask, because I don't know this American scheme, but at least there's something where actually they try to not just know about the incomes and expenses of the farm, but actually also use this for understanding the internal workings of agriculture, especially of the link between the grain production and the fodder production and the feeding of the cows, and then the production of the milk and so on. And the pigs.
Yeah, but I think it's basically something which starts earlier than sort of the post-war period, because the Danish Statistical Office sort of start to gather these kinds of information briefly already about the First World War, right? And then gradually increases this and publish some of these results. So I don't see it as something which is coming from the outside after the war, but something which has been of interest for quite a period of time.
Yeah, so this bureau, which I mentioned, is set up in 1916. It starts by surveying like 80 farms, and then it goes to like 1,000 per year or something, which still, if you have 200,000 farms, it's a small sample. It's not a full survey, and it's the people who want to participate. So it's probably not a representative sample, but that basically you have. And Statistics Denmark actually, or the statistical office, incorporates this in part and collects price data and other sorts of things, and uses this also in the 30s, I think, when it comes to tax payments and tax assessments and so on. They use this in part to benchmark some of the reliefs that agriculture gets this data. So this is sort of official data, but again, in the Danish case, the official data is collected in a joint venture with people who want that and private organizations, which I guess is different from much of what the Green Revolution in general is about, which seems to be quite top down.
Okay, I see that Netza has another question. I prefer if you go ahead and read the question, or it's better, I think.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you both for the brilliant presentations. Well, I was thinking in how we can relate the Danish experience with the history of the Green Revolution, maybe in the long run. And well, I was thinking in the born of the dairy industry in the United States, especially in the book of Dupuy. And well, after that, in the 1940s and 1950s, here in Mexico, the dairy industry is impulsed by the government. It was impulsed by the government, trying to replicate the models of the US. So, well, thinking in that things, I have two questions for you. The first one is, can we think about the relationship between the Danish experience in the Green Revolution in long term as a process with multiple foci, thinking of a US dairy industry that was nourished by advances in Northern Europe, whose technologies and development patterns were developed in different points of the global north to later circulate towards the global south, thinking in different logic, different focus of the Green Revolution in the long run. And can we think of the Green Revolution is another way of thinking in the Green Revolution, only as a part of a much broader transformation process of global agriculture. Linking, for example, and I was thinking in the dispositions of you, and processes such as urbanization, international markets, etc., and whose importance of the Green Revolution lies only in a technical field. As are two different questions. I don't know if you understand well. If not, I can repeat or maybe in Spanish.
Maybe if I maybe I can try to go for the first thing. My co-author Paul Sharp and Nina Bobek-Faslic have a paper which is called Immigrant Communities and Knowledge Spillovers, which is about immigrants from Denmark and technology transfer to the United States. So in the American Economic Journal Macroeconomics, I think. So what happens is that apparently that big communities, especially in Wisconsin, of Danish immigrants, and actually some of the stuff that I talked about, centrifuges, cooperatives, and so on, moved there through the networks of immigrants. And even really one of the first cream separators in the United States apparently is imported from Denmark, and there's a story about that and so on. At the same time, for example, what I know about this is the Biological Innovation book by Alan Olmsted and Paul Rohde. And in there, many things actually, when you read them, especially about the dairy sector, read like the same stories from Denmark, but just with American names and so on. So there seems to be a co-evolution, and I think there's also exchange actually in this, and potentially Paul and Nina discovered a few of these things. So there seems to be already a knowledge community actually in this in part. And I guess you would find this also in other parts of agriculture. It's just that in this case, I know a bit more about that. The second part of the question, I'm not really sure I can say much about that.
No, well, just as a supplement to this, also what you talked about, Markus, is that here in Brazil, actually the cheese production was to a large degree initiated by Danish diarists who went here in the early 20th century and discovered that, well, you don't eat cheese in Brazil, so they thought that would be a good idea. So they started to make a bad cheese in Brazil as they were used to do it in Denmark. I don't know whether that was a good idea from a Brazilian point of view. But I think I'm trying to address the second part of your question. It's if we go down this road, I think it makes sense. But the problem could be that sort of everything sort of starts to fit together, right? So it starts off being a history of technology, a history of urbanization, a history of innovation in the agrarian field, etc. So it might make sense, but also it becomes very voluminous. So it could be difficult sort of to close it down as sort of a narrow field of investigation, because it could end up as something like the history of the world in the last 150 years, which makes a lot of sense. But maybe then the Green Revolution just ends up as it's not a side point, but maybe not the most important one in this context. And well, maybe we then forget the Green Revolution a little bit, and that could be okay if that's another thing you want. But maybe then it's not. We are not talking about the same thing anymore.
Well, I don't know if we have more questions or somebody else wants to close with some more issues. So otherwise, I think that's a good point to close the session. I invite you for the next session that will be also about Europe the next Tuesday, the 16th of June, and we'll open also for this period that I think that is more important, as we see, as Thomas also pointed before. And I would like to help both of you, Thomas and Markus. It has been wonderful, and I think that you open us a lot of questions and landscapes for this seminar. So thanks. See you next Tuesday. Welcome.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.